Welcome to the Metaphorosis magazine podcast, your home for beautifully made speculative fiction. The magazine is edited by B. Morris Allen, and I'm your host, Matt Gomez. This month's story is But No Man Moved Me Till the Tide by Laurel Beckley. Laurel Beckley is a writer, Marine Corps veteran, and librarian. She lives with her wife, fur creatures, and a collection of gently neglected houseplants. Find her online at the suspectedbibliophile.home.blog or on Twitter at Laurel the Reader. That's LaurelThereader. Let's jump in. Myrna met him on the bluffs above the cove after dinner. It was a moonless night, the height of autumn, a night for sea monsters and storms. She closed her eyes, letting the presence of ocean wrap around her, as if she were the island being caressed by waves, as if she were swimming through the depths in her true form, currents whispering across her fur. The wind whipped her curly brown hair, tickling and tangling while its icy touch nipped her exposed cheeks and ears. The approaching storm sat offshore still, kicking up the whitecaps and pushing the stench of salt and fish guts and rain. It seemed like each year the storms arrived earlier and earlier, and with them the dangers of the deep. Myrna opened her eyes. Fog enveloped everything but the piercing beam of the lighthouse above. Flash. 4 seconds. Flash. She smelled Gabriel's human musk before he crested the bluff. He was freshly shaved, hair slicked down with orange-scented pomade, and wearing his nicest suit, which happened to be his lighthouse keeper's uniform. His hands, however, held his day's work embedded within each crease of skin. Hello, Miss Coates, Gabriel said. His eyebrows bunched together as he eyed the pelt she carried in her arms, cradled like a child. She'd brought her pelt at her mother's insistence, tucking the gray speckled fur so it resembled a jacket, the paws clenched tight in her fists so he could not wrest it from her. This was nothing like the uncivilized days when humans stole otterkin pelts and forced them onto land. But Myrna remembered the old stories. She didn't hand it over. Not yet. As an otterkin, Myrna had known this moment would come. But unlike her cousins and older sisters, who'd spent their girlhood afternoons crafting scrapbooks and dreaming of the mysterious spouses who had arrived to bind the wild thing lurking inside all otterkin, Myrna had stared into the white-capped waves surrounding their island home. They'd grown up and found spouse-keepers, while Myrna had refused each human placed in her path. She'd always preferred the ocean to land, her soft fur to pink flesh, and now her fate was here, in the form of her most persistent suitor, who would propose to her at any moment. He'd ask for her pelt, and half her soul, and she'd have to obey, because that was what otterkin did. Myrna clamped her lips tight to keep the brewing cry of refusal from erupting across the sea. The wild thing inside her scraped her chest, wanting out. Silence stretched between them, interrupted by the squawking of a gull. "Would you like to walk along the ridge?" Gabriel asked. Myrna nodded, not trusting herself to speak without screaming. She could do this, for herself and for her family. Gabriel was a kind man, a man who rescued jellyfish and fixed broken seagull wings and treated her younger cousins as children. But what person wanted an otter wife? A woman bound forever, a woman who was strong and loyal and could never leave, even in the most isolated of postings. A woman shuddered. Their boots crunched sand and hollow grass and rocks. Each step felt heavy as tradition, and her family's increasing expectations weighed upon her, heavier than the cloudy night sky. Her family hadn't seemed to mind the loss of half of themselves. They had welcomed it with sighs of relief, as if they'd spent their whole lives waiting for the wild thing to be tamed. Her sisters would say she was lucky to have such a kind man wanting her. Her mother would tell her to stop protesting and submit, because this was as good as it got, and far better than she could have expected. But how would it change her, to give her soul to another's keeping? Gabriel stopped at the trailhead leading down to the cove where her family swam each moon night, the only time their spouses allowed them to assume their true forms. Waves passed over the pebbled beach. The rocks trilled as the water ebbed back into the ocean, the sound rising through the fog. I know it's fast and we should have brought a chaperone, but we worked together all summer and I thought, I want to do things proper for you. Gabriel paused, fiddling with the lapels of his jacket. My posting here ends in the spring. My next station is to the north in Allenshaw. It's a single keeper position. A single keeper with a spouse, if they had one. Without a spouse, he would be alone for the 2-year tour. This was why he wanted a wife, why he pursued Myrna. It was a shame, Myrna thought, that she was the only one of marriageable age. Gabriel bent, one knee resting on the rocks and sand, and looked up at her. Her breath caught. It was happening. Myrna, Gabriel began, stretching a hand toward her. His fingers brushed against her pelt. She jerked back from the touch, a lump clogging her throat, stopping the scream, forcing it through her body instead of out, until she felt like she would explode if she... Myrna. His eyes were wide, pleading, the color of the ocean on a summer day. But reality was staring at her too, and even though she was expecting it, she couldn't give it up. She took another step backward, then another, and another, one after the other, down past the rock outcroppings and the verbena, and the sand as the waves crashed harder against the shore, and the pebble song screamed across the rocks, and the storm wind picked up into a howl. She ran until cold water kissed her shins, and then she wrapped her pelt about her shoulders and dove into the sea. The fog and frigid water swallowed her whole, engulfing her in a harsh and angry and cold world as an undertow snagged her, dragging her down and down and down to the silt and rock bottom. Myrna shed her boots with a kick, giving them to the ocean and shoving her feet into her pelt. She never swam in her human form. How ungainly, how slow, when she could be majestic. Something brushed against the thick fur on her back. She yelped, spinning to catch the silvered flicker of a giant sea bass slicing into the deep. She twisted her body, hooking one paw around an algae frond as an anchor while she oriented herself, eyes adjusting to the dark. She had been dragged further and faster than she had expected. She was no longer in the shelter of the cove, with its fields of coral and algae blooming in red and brown and mud green, but had been pulled beyond the jetty, where the bottom dropped and the tall kelp grew, where she was forbidden to go alone. Her heart hammered. She needed to get back to shore, to face... Myrna did not know what fate awaited an unwed otterkin. She'd only known of one, Ede, who'd left the island when Myrna was a toddler, and was only mentioned in whispered conversations amongst the oldest otter wives on winter nights when the shutters shuddered from the howling storms. Myrna had broached the subject of not marrying once, and her mother had told her otterkin always wed, because that was what was done, and that she'd better be quiet or the sea monsters would take her. In marrying, an otterkin severed her ties to the sea and wildness, and bound herself to humanity and civilization, and that was that. Since she had turned 18, her mother had shoved men, and later women and a few people who were neither man or woman, onto her daughter with increasing desperation and irritation. None of her family understood Myrna's reluctance. They had been happy to give away their pelts, to set themselves firmly on land and a life of marriage and babies. They treated their monthly excursions to the cove as honoring their history, but while the sea was the source of their livelihood, it wasn't their life. It didn't sustain their souls, not like it did Myrna. She craved the wildness with a yearning she couldn't quite put into words. In the sea, she was free. She didn't want to give any part of herself away. Myrna closed her eyes to stop her tears. The ocean didn't need more salt. She had to go home and face her mother's disappointment. She had taken only one stroke toward shore when she heard it. The song rippled through the waves, soft and cooing. It came from beyond the tall kelp forest, the sound winding through the fronds and the stipes. Thoughts of her family, of Gabriel and expectation, fell away. Longing screamed through her, tearing away thought and reason and rationale, and pulling all of her wants and desires just out of reach. The singer yearned, just as she did. There were no words, but she knew this desire, this need for something beyond. This desire to fill the hollow in her chest, to heal wounds scraped raw and bleeding. The ocean's bottom plunged away as she emerged from the kelp forest. Myrna kicked backward and grabbed a frond with her paws, the cold undercurrent threatening to sweep her into its depths. The song faded. Myrna clutched the frond, straining to hear. The ocean was quiet, and her heartbeat thrummed in her chest, and her chest ached from the need for air, and the song grew louder once again. The singer was right over there, and the song turned sword-sharp and bloodthirsty as thick tentacle whipped up from the depths, spearing toward her. Myrna screamed as another tentacle rose to join the first. She thrashed through the fronds, retreating through the forest toward shore as fast as her paws could pump. Her vision grayed. Her lungs burned. She had to breathe. She burst to the surface and sucked rain-clogged air through her sharp teeth. The waves rolled high and vicious, and the downpour of rain mixed with the tears streaking her fur-covered cheeks. When she caught her breath, she'd been in one place too long, far too long. Surely the monster should have caught her by now. She plunged back into the water. There was no sign of pursuit. The monster had vanished, leaving only its song winding through the fronds of the forest, once again softly yearning, laced with such sorrow and regret that Myrna nearly swam toward it again. She fought the song, fear keeping her oriented to the shore. She swam the entire way without stopping, until she emerged onto the pebbled beach, never noticing the gills that had sprouted beneath her ears. The storm raged about her as she cried and coughed the salt water from her lungs. Her sobs mixed with the crash of waves and the howl of wind. She'd grown up hearing wintertime stories of sea monsters and the dangers of the deep waters. The past few years of winter storms had brought the sea monsters closer to the island, but there was ocean's breadth in the difference between hearing about a danger and facing it. Even on shore, she could feel the song echoing through her bones, and she did not know if her tears were of relief or regret. Not one of her family had ever said the sea monsters sang. Gabriel kept up his courtship as if the night on the bluff had never happened, leaving flowers and a pink ribbon and a mewling gray kitten, as if the gift of a living creature would endear her to him. Myrna avoided him and hid her pelt in the carved space of a dead tree, and tried to forget that the night of his proposal and the monster had ever happened. Myrna heard the song again as she helped her youngest niece crack a muscle during their next moon night. She'd volunteered to watch the youngest girls, to teach them to pull their pelts about their shoulders, how to find the best rocks and tuck them into their foreleg pouches, how to surf the streams into the kelp meadow and forage for the tastiest sea urchins. She'd hoped that in teaching them she'd find that spark of motherhood, that desire for creation and nurturing that seemed to reside in everyone but her. Instead, she felt nothing but frustration. The song was faint and lonely, and before she knew it, she'd drifted to the edge of the meadow and was between the first stipes of tall kelp. She pulled herself away. Her otter limbs felt long and sinewy and strange, and dragged her niece to the surface, checking over her shoulder to see who else in her family was captured by the monster's siren song. "Did you hear that?" Myrna asked her niece. "Hear what?" the little asked, nibbling on a clump of seaweed. A hiss nearby, from the cluster of teenage cousins floating in the middle of the cove, their teeth bared in silent accusation for stringing Gabriel along when they would have been a much better match, if only they had been old enough to marry. At the weight of their stares, Myrna pulled her niece to shore, fighting the song's pull with every stroke. No one seemed to hear it. There must be something wrong with her, something that made her different enough to hear the sea monsters when no one else could. This difference scared her, because she didn't know what it meant. As fall turned to winter, Myrna retreated into herself, avoiding her family as diligently as she did Gabriel. She tried to ignore the gossip surrounding her, from her aunties, who gathered in clumps by the fireplace at nighttime, muttering,
Not like Eid. No, not like her.
She tried to avoid her married cousins and sisters, but they sought her out while she was in the middle of her chores, telling her it was time to stop staring at the sea and get married to Gabriel already. They never said it outright, but she knew they thought it was past time for her to put her pelt into a human's keeping. Taming their wild thing was the civilized thing to do. As much as she dodged her cousins, Myrna couldn't avoid her mother, who just eyed her with a mix of frustration and pity. Myrna bottled herself up, suppressing the wild thing that burned in her chest. She craved escape, but unlike before when she could flee into the water whenever her family's expectations for her future became too much, now a sea monster waited for her in the depths. She knew it was still there, because it stalked her. Its siren song reached out to her on land, humming incessantly in her ears. The further she pulled from her family, the more the song tugged her, strumming along the tip of her tongue, leaving her irritable and filled with a yearning she could not explain because she did not have the words. It infected her soul, and she could not tell anyone because she didn't think anyone else had ever felt like she had before. Surrounded by her perfectly content aunts and cousins and sisters, Myrna felt like an island in a vast sea, besieged by fierce storms on all sides. It made sense that the sea monster targeted her. She was different. She was wrong. Then the monster's song was her punishment for staying unwed and turning her back on tradition, for keeping the wild thing inside her instead of giving it away. Rain lashed the roof. Wind clawed the wood siding. The lighthouse's foghorn trumpeted, warning ships away. The monster's song shrieked above everything else, high and vicious and hungry. Winter was sea monster season, when storms pushed the creatures closer to shore. This year was different. 4 wrecks this month alone, each with survivors who spoke of tentacles wrapping about the masts, hurling their ships against the rocky shoals. The head keeper told his otterkin wife that he had never heard the ocean sing during a storm before, and she had told him it was just the wind over the rocks. But these stories brought the aunts together, whispers of Eid and never so sad before, and once, just when they thought she was out of earshot, not Myrna. It was all a circle, from Gabriel chasing her to her aunt's outraged stares, to her mother's sighs, to her cousin's whispers, to Myrna berating herself, asking what was wrong with her. Why couldn't she just say yes? Why couldn't she submit like the rest of her family? The monster's song changed, from vicious cry to sweet coo, warm and welcoming. Myrna pulled her pillow over her head, trying to drown out thought and sound with goose down and cotton. Her bedroom door banged open. "Abigail is missing," Myrna's mother said. They rushed outside, Myrna urging her youngest siblings to stay inside. Her aunts and eldest cousins were already racing toward the cove, their white nightgowns clinging to their strong bodies, turning them into wraiths attacking the night. Abigail was halfway down the beach when they found her, bent double and sobbing as she staggered toward the churning black water. One of Myrna's aunts grabbed her arm, but the girl flung her off and was almost in the water when another aunt tackled her. It took all of them to hold the girl down. Her eyes rolled white and her mouth open in a scream of need as her heels drummed the pebbled beach. Someone clubbed Abigail across the temple, and the girl sagged. Her limp arms stretched toward the water, as if even unconscious she yearned for what the song promised. Myrna stepped away from the thrum, rubbing her bloodied nose. She was on the verge of tears and didn't know why. The song caught her, its crackling desire meeting the wild thing inside, and she took 3 steps toward the water without even realizing it, when the sharp sting of a slap brought her back to reality. Her oldest cousin grabbed her arm and dragged her back to her house, snarling that Myrna shouldn't have come, that this business was married women's work. The aunties gathered at Myrna's mother's house that night, clustering about the hearth. Myrna boiled water for tea. She knew she wasn't allowed at this meeting, but she thought if she made herself useful and kept quiet, she might learn why this was happening. Myrna arrived with the tray right as her eldest aunt jabbed a finger at Myrna's mother and hissed, "Tell that girl to get her head straight and accept the boy already. We cannot have another Eid." She couldn't stop herself. "What happened to Ede?" Her aunts turned, their eyes dark and vicious, their teeth flashing otter sharp from the light of the fire. "Go back to bed," her mother said. Myrna fled. Another storm hovered on the horizon. Myrna grabbed her jacket from its peg by the door and left the house, ignoring her niece's stares as they stopped flipping through last season's fashion magazine to watch her. Their whispers started the second her back was turned. Myrna wished they knew that she was just as scared as they were, that she didn't know why the storms were so bad this winter, and why something lurked in the cove beyond the breakers. She wished they knew all these things, and yet she couldn't tell them, because speaking the words meant she'd have to admit she couldn't marry Gabriel, and to admit that meant that she was wrong and broken and the cause of everything. She was the reason her family suffered. She knew she had to fix it, but she didn't know how. The only option she saw was unacceptable. Surely there was a way to keep her family and her soul, to keep herself for herself and herself alone. She walked straight to the shore without pausing to check her pelt in its hidey hole. The waves were tall and vicious, sea foam whipping off the whitecaps and flying toward shore. The pebble beach's song screeched like hunting birds, even as the whisper of the sea monster's song caressed her cheek. Myrna wondered what it would be like to give in to the song, to dive into the waters, to sing instead of listen. "Myrna?" She turned away from the water. Gabriel stood at the top of the trailhead to the cove, his head bowed against the wind, his arms wrapped protectively around something the size of a winter jacket. Her stomach clenched. He closed the distance the second he saw the horror on her face, thrusting her pelt toward her with both hands. "Your mother gave it to me." Rain stabbed her cheeks, ice cold and spear sharp. She didn't take the pelt. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. So, her family had chosen for her, had gone back to the old days of pelt stealing. It was done. She had thought she'd feel something, that love her mother mentioned, or resignation or revulsion or anything at all, but her family's betrayal emptied her, excavating the wild thing that had lived inside her until she was a hollow shell. Above her, the lighthouse beacon flashed. 4 seconds. Another flash, cutting through rain and clouds and reminding her that anything she had wanted was just a dream, untouchable and non-existent. Words tumbled from his mouth, spilling like sea foam across the pebbled beach. "I really did want to wait. I had no choice. I'm being reassigned early." His hands clutched her pelt, his fingers smoothing and straightening it with as much gentleness as he had shown that newborn kitten. She'd given the kitten to a younger cousin, but she couldn't give this away. His voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the shrieks of the approaching storm. "I'll give it to you whenever you want, not just on moon days." He looked up at her, his face earnest. "I will love you. And you will learn to love me too?" As if she had any choice in the matter anymore. "I will be whatever you wish of me, husband." Her voice was a croak, the word husband tasting like rotten fish in her mouth. Hurt danced across Gabriel's eyes, and he tucked her pelt against his chest. It lay in his arms like a dead animal. He opened his mouth and took a step forward, but his eyes widened as he took in something behind her. "Oh, seas," he gasped. Myrna turned to see what it was, and he grabbed her arm, jerking her toward him. A fierce howl pierced the crash of waves. There was a flash above, the lighthouse slicing through the fog, and Myrna turned in time to see a massive tentacle lift out of the waves to wrap about the boulders at the edge of the cove. Another scream, a hunting song, angry and hungry. The sea monster had come to shore at last. Gabriel lunged for her. Myrna tried to sidestep him, tried to flee, but he grabbed her upper arm and whipped her round to face him. "No," he gasped. "I won't let you go." Myrna stared into his eyes and saw her future unspool before her. Marriage and babies and expectation and all the things she could never do. Perhaps there would be pockets of joy and laughter with Gabriel, but she would never throw off the shroud of imprisonment. If she stayed, she would never refill the hollow inside her. The fear that had been building ever since that night in the kelp forest vanished, leaving only resolution. Sea Monster's song rose into the air, a triumphant battle cry. But she was not afraid. She did not want to die, but better that than the future that awaited her if she stayed with Gabriel. He tried to pull her ashore, but she stepped away, jerking her pelt from his unresisting fingers. "I was never yours." He did not reach for her again. The song softened, the sea monster shifting away as Myrna took step after step down the uneven edge of the jetty. With the fog shifted, there was a woman standing at the end, wearing her nudity with the unconscious grace of an otterkin. And Myrna knew she was an otterkin. For despite her sharp teeth and the kelp streaking her curly brown hair, she was the mirror image of Myrna's mother. "I have grown tired of waiting for you, niece," Ede said. Myrna lifted her chin, trying to hide her confusion. "I thought the sea monster was here to kill me." "There is death and death." Ede remained where she was, unafraid. "Did you ever wonder where the sea monsters came from?" Myrna hadn't. Sea monsters had always existed, ruling the winter seas. "I don't understand." Then she did. It was obvious in retrospect. Sea monsters and otterkin were the same. She could not see through the fog, but she imagined Gabriel stood on shore, still holding her pelt. Beyond him were her family and everything she knew. They were the ones who chose to bind themselves instead of embracing the wild thing that lived inside. "They know, but they are afraid," Ede said, her voice soft and gentle. "Why do you think they honor marriage and tradition as they do? But some of us cannot fit into their world, no matter how hard we try. And so we choose another way." The lighthouse flashed above, its beam cutting through the fog, reminding her of the island and family and tradition. A wave crashed over the rocks, sea foam swirling about her legs, the ocean promising her adventure and a life bound to herself and the sea alone. Myrna was caught between sea and shore, but the hollow in her chest felt just a little bit less empty. Because for the first time in her life, there was a choice beyond what she'd always known. Myrna turned back to her aunt. "There are more people like us?" "An entire ocean full." Ede stretched out her hand in silent offer. "Freedom. But in exchange, she'd become a monster. She would lose her family and everything she'd known. But she would gain herself. She would live. She would be among others just like her." Myrna glanced toward the shore one last time, and perhaps eventually, she could return and make her own way back to her family. Both her and the wild thing that lived inside. She took her aunt's hand, and together, they leapt into the sea. That was But No Man Moved Me Till the Tide by Laurel Beckley. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you'd leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you listen to us on. Or better yet, share the magazine and podcast with a friend. If you'd like to listen to more speculative fiction, visit us online at magazine.metaphorosis.com, on Blue Sky at metaphorosis.bsky.social, or on Mastodon at metaphorosis@writing.exchange.